Millionaire CEO was spending his birthday alone, until a woman walked in with a child who looked just like him. What happened next will shock you. The New York skyline glittered like a sea of diamonds against the inky black canvas of night. Alexander Knight stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, swirling an amber liquid in a crystal glass. The whiskey, aged 38 years, just like him, cost more than what most people made in a month. But money had long stopped being a concern for Alexander. As the CEO of Knight Enterprises, he had built an empire worth billions from the ground up. Tonight was his birthday, but no celebratory music played. No voices filled the vast empty space of his penthouse. No birthday cake waited on the marble counter, just silence, the whiskey, and the city lights below. Alexander took a slow sip, savoring the burn as it traveled down his throat. His phone buzzed on the glass coffee table. Probably Jessica, his assistant, checking if he had changed his mind about the party she had spent weeks planning. He ignored it. The party would have been excessive. 100 guests, most of whom he barely knew, raising glasses to celebrate a man they only pretended to understand. Celebrities, business partners, politicians, all there to be seen rather than to see him. Alexander had canceled it yesterday, much to Jessica's dismay. But sir, everything is ready. The venue, the catering, the entertainment. Cancel it all, he had said, his voice leaving no room for argument. I prefer to spend my birthday alone. And alone he was, just as he had been for the past decade. Relationships were messy, family was complicated. Success was simple. Work hard, make smart decisions, and let nothing get in your way. Not emotions, not attachments, certainly not birthdays. The whiskey glass caught the light as he raised it to his lips again. 38 years. 18 of them spent building his company, sacrificing sleep, relationships, and anything resembling a normal life. Was it worth it? The question rarely crossed his mind, but birthdays had a way of inviting unwelcome reflection. His penthouse was a testament to his success. Minimalist, expensive, perfect. Every piece of furniture, every painting on the wall, every electronic device had been carefully selected not for comfort, but for aesthetic and function. Nothing was out of place. Nothing was unnecessary. Like the man himself, the space was controlled, precise, and utterly devoid of warmth. Alexander walked over to his bar and poured another drink. The only sound was the ice clinking against the glass. Outside, the city moved in its chaotic dance. People rushing home to families, to lovers, to lives filled with the very things Alexander had deemed unnecessary distractions. His phone buzzed again. This time, he picked it up. I told you I want to be alone tonight, Jessica, he said, his voice hard. But sir, the board members sent over a gift. It's in the lobby. Security wants to know if they should bring it up. Alexander sighed. No, tell them to leave it with the concierge. I'll deal with it tomorrow. Yes, sir, and happy birthday. Alexander ended the call without responding. Happy. What a strange concept to attach to a day that simply marked the passage of time. He wasn't unhappy. Unhappiness required expectation, and Alexander had stopped expecting anything from life besides what he could control. He returned to the window, watching as tiny cars moved along the streets below. From up here, they looked like toys, and the people inside them even smaller. This was how Alexander preferred to view the world, from a distance, observing rather than participating. His gaze shifted to his reflection in the glass. His face, though handsome, had hardened over the years. Lines had formed around his eyes and mouth, not from laughter, but from concentration and determination. His green eyes, once described by a lover as full of life, now looked back at him with cold calculation. The memory of that lover, what was her name? Lena, flickered briefly in his mind before he pushed it away. Ancient history. Another life. The clock on the wall showed 10:30 p.m., another birthday almost over. Alexander raised his glass in a mock toast to himself, a ritual he performed every year. To another year of success, he murmured to the empty room. Just as the glass touched his lips, a sound broke the silence. The elevator, his private elevator that only a select few had access to, was moving. The digital display above the doors showed it ascending, heading toward his penthouse. Alexander frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone, and security always called before sending someone up. His fingers tightened around the whiskey glass as the elevator continued its climb. Floor 38, 39, 40, 41, 42. The elevator stopped at his floor. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft ding that seemed to echo through the penthouse, the doors slid open. Alexander set his glass down, his body tensing. He had enemies. Success bred jealousy and resentment. His security team was the best money could buy, but nothing was foolproof. A woman stepped out of the elevator first. She was in her mid-30s, with dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a simple but elegant black dress, and despite her obvious nervousness, she carried herself with dignity. There was something familiar about her, but Alexander couldn't place it. Then he saw the child. A boy, no older than 8, stepped out beside the woman. He had dark hair like her, but his eyes, Alexander felt a jolt of recognition that he couldn't immediately explain. The child's eyes were a striking, unusual shade of green, the exact same shade as his own. The woman's gaze locked with Alexander's. For a moment, recognition flickered across her face, followed by a series of emotions Alexander couldn't or wouldn't interpret. Fear, determination, hope. "Hello, Alexander," she said, her voice steady despite the slight tremble in her hands. "It's been a long time." Alexander didn't move from his spot. "You shouldn't be here," he said coldly. "How did you get past security?" The woman's lips curved into a sad smile. "You still have Jessica as your assistant. She remembers me." The name clicked into place then. Lena. Lena Mitchell. 9 years ago. A 3-month affair that had ended when things started to get too serious. When she started talking about feelings and futures, things that had no place in Alexander's carefully constructed life. "Whatever you're selling, I'm not buying," Alexander said, reaching for his phone. "I'll have security escort you out." Lena placed a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. "We're not leaving until you hear what I have to say." Alexander's finger hovered over the security number. Something in her tone made him hesitate. The boy was staring at him with an unnerving intensity, those green eyes, his green eyes, taking in every detail of Alexander's face. "Happy birthday, Alexander," Lena said quietly. Then, with a gentle nudge, she urged the boy forward. "This is your son." The words hung in the air between them. Alexander's hand dropped to his side, the phone forgotten. A humorless laugh escaped his lips, but it sounded hollow, even to his own ears. "That's not possible," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, he found himself looking more closely at the boy. The shape of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows, the way he stood, straight-backed, chin slightly raised, like looking in a mirror that reflected the past. "His name is Elliot," Lena continued as if Alexander hadn't spoken. "Elliot Alexander Mitchell." "This is ridiculous," Alexander snapped, the initial shock giving way to anger. "I don't have a son. I would know if I had a son." Lena reached into her purse and pulled out a manila folder. She walked forward, her heels clicking on the marble floor, and placed it on the glass coffee table. "You would know if I had told you," she said simply. "I didn't." Alexander made no move to reach for the folder. The boy, Elliot, continued to watch him with those unsettlingly familiar eyes. "Why are you here, Lena?" Alexander asked, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "If you're after money—" "I'm not," she interrupted. "I've never asked you for a cent, have I? Even though I had every right to." It was true. In the 9 years since their breakup, she had never contacted him, never tried to negotiate, threaten, or even communicate. She had simply disappeared from his life as abruptly as she had entered it. Then why now? Why tonight? Lena's composure slipped for just a moment, a flash of pain crossing her features before she controlled it. "Open the folder, Alexander." Against his better judgment, Alexander moved to the coffee table and flipped open the folder. Inside were several documents, hospital records, a birth certificate with his name listed as the father, and on top, a sealed envelope with his name written in Lena's handwriting. But what caught his eye was the document beneath it all. A DNA test report. 99.9% match. "This could be faked," he said, but the words sounded weak even to his own ears. "It's not," Lena said simply. "You can run your own tests if you want. The result will be the same." Alexander's gaze shifted to Elliot again. The boy hadn't said a word since arriving, but his presence filled the room more completely than any sound could have. "If what you're saying is true," Alexander said slowly, "then you've kept him from me for 8 years. You had no right." "I had every right," Lena cut in, her voice sharp. "You made it very clear what your priorities were, Alexander. Your company, your success, your freedom. There was no room in your life for me, let alone a child." Memory flashed through Alexander's mind, their last night together, her tears, his cold dismissal. "I never promised you anything more than this, Lena. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "You should have told me," he insisted, but the conviction in his voice was fading. "Would it have made a difference?" Lena asked. "Would you have wanted him?" Before Alexander could answer, Elliot spoke for the first time, his voice clear and surprisingly steady for a child. "Mom said you wouldn't want me," he said, his green eyes, Alexander's eyes, unwavering. "Were she and I right?" The question hung in the air, simple yet devastating in its directness. Alexander, who had built his career on always having the right answer, found himself speechless. In the silence that followed, the city continued to glitter below them, indifferent to the drama unfolding in the penthouse above. And for the first time in years, Alexander Knight, the man who controlled everything in his life with meticulous precision, found himself facing a situation he couldn't control, a question he couldn't answer, and a pair of eyes he couldn't escape. His son's eyes. Alexander let out a sharp, humorless laugh that echoed through the penthouse. The sound was harsh, defensive, a wall of sound erected between himself and the truth that stood before him in the form of a small boy with his eyes. "This is ridiculous," he repeated, more firmly this time. "I don't have a son." He turned away from them both, walking back to the bar. He needed another drink, needed the burn of alcohol to clear the fog that was settling over his normally razor-sharp mind. Lena and the boy remained where they stood, neither advancing nor retreating, like they were giving him space to process, to deny, to run through every stage of rejection before the inevitable acceptance. "I had a DNA test done," Lena said quietly. "It's all there in the folder." "Papers can be forged," Alexander snapped, pouring himself another 3 fingers of whiskey. "DNA tests can be manipulated." "Look at him, Alexander," Lena urged. "Really look at him. Can you honestly say you don't see yourself?" Against his better judgment, Alexander turned. The boy, Elliot, stared back at him, unblinking. Even the way he stood, slightly defiant yet composed, was a mirror of Alexander's own stance. And those eyes? No one had eyes that exact shade of green. No one except Alexander himself, and his father before him. Elliot took a small step forward. "You look like the pictures," he said simply. Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Pictures?" "Mom keeps pictures of you, in a box under her bed. She thinks I don't know." Alexander shot a look at Lena, who had the grace to look embarrassed. "Not many," she said defensively. "Just reminders." "Reminders of what?" Alexander asked coldly. "Of the man who gave me my son," Lena replied, her voice soft but firm. "Whatever else happened between us, I never regretted that." Alexander turned away again, unable to face the sincerity in her eyes. His mind was racing, calculating possibilities and probabilities. If what they were saying was true, if this child really was his son, what did that mean? What did they want from him? Money, recognition, a relationship? The very thought made his chest tighten with something close to panic. "Why now?" he asked, his back still turned to them. "Why wait 8 years to tell me I have a son?" There was a pause, heavy with unspoken words. Then Lena sighed. "Read the letter, Alexander. It's all in there." Alexander glanced at the folder still open on his coffee table. The sealed envelope sat on top, his name written in Lena's elegant handwriting. For a moment he considered refusing, ordering them both out of his penthouse, calling security, pretending this night had never happened. But the boy's eyes, his eyes, kept drawing him back. With a resigned sigh, Alexander walked to the coffee table and picked up the envelope. The paper was thick, expensive. Lena had always had good taste. He tore it open with more force than necessary and unfolded the letter inside. As he read, images flashed through his mind. Lena laughing in the sunlight, her head thrown back, eyes crinkled at the corners. Lena in his bed, hair spread across his pillow like a dark fan. Lena crying silently as he told her it was over, that he had no room in his life for what she wanted from him. Dear Alexander, if you're reading this, it means I've finally found the courage to tell you about our son. His name is Elliot, and he turns 8 next month. He's smart, kind, and stubborn, just like his father. He has your eyes, your chin, and, unfortunately, your tendency to overthink everything. I never told you about him because I knew you wouldn't want him. You made it clear that your life had no room for attachments or responsibilities outside of your company. At the time, I respected your choice, even as it broke my heart. But now, I have no choice. I'm sick, Alex. Cancer. If something happens to me, Elliot has no one else. No grandparents, no siblings, no one but you. I'm not asking for anything for myself. I've managed on my own all these years, and I was prepared to continue doing so. But I can't leave Elliot alone in this world. He deserves to know his father, and you deserve to know your son, even if you decide you still don't want him in your life. All I ask is that you meet him. Talk to him. See for yourself the amazing person he is becoming. After that, whatever you decide, I'll respect it. But please, Alex, don't punish him for my decision to keep him from you. That was my choice, not his. I've never stopped. The letter ended abruptly, as if Lena couldn't bring herself to finish the sentence. Or perhaps she had written more, but cut it off before sending it. Either way, the words hung in the air, incomplete, yet somehow still powerful. Alexander folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. When he looked up, Lena was watching him, her expression guarded. Elliot had wandered to the window and was staring out at the city lights, his small face reflected in the glass. "You're sick," Alexander stated flatly. Lena nodded. "Terminal. The doctors give me a few months, maybe weeks." The words should have shocked him, but Alexander felt oddly numb. He'd built his life around avoiding emotional entanglements precisely because they introduced variables he couldn't control. Death was the ultimate uncontrollable variable. "I'm sorry," he said, and was surprised to find he meant it. "I didn't come here for sympathy," Lena replied. "I came because Elliot needs to know you before—" She trailed off, her eyes flicking to the boy by the window. "Before you die," Alexander finished for her, his voice low enough that Elliot couldn't hear. Lena flinched slightly but nodded. "He doesn't have anyone else." Alexander ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, disheveling it for the first time that day. "What exactly are you asking of me, Lena? Money for his care? A guardian? What?" "I'm asking you to know your son," Lena said simply. "To let him know you. What happens after that is up to you." Alexander laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "Just like that? You drop this bombshell on me and expect me to, instantly become father of the year? I have a company to run, responsibilities, a life that doesn't include surprise children." "I know," Lena acknowledged. "I'm not asking you to change your life overnight. Just spend some time with him. Let him see who his father is." "And if I refuse?" Lena's expression hardened slightly. "Then we'll leave, and you'll never have to see either of us again. But you'll know he exists, Alex. You'll know he's out there somewhere. Can you really live with that?" Before Alexander could answer, Elliot turned from the window. "You have a lot of buildings," he said matter-of-factly. Alexander blinked, momentarily thrown by the non-sequitur. "What?" Elliot pointed to the skyline. "Mom said you build things. All those lights, are they all yours?" Despite himself, Alexander felt a small smile tugging at his lips. "Not all of them, just a few." "Which ones?" Alexander hesitated, then joined Elliot at the window. He pointed to a sleek skyscraper with a distinctive spire. "That one, and that one there, with the blue lights, and the complex over there by the river." Elliot studied each building with intense concentration. "Cool," he said finally, then, with the abrupt honesty of children, "Mom says you're really rich, but not very nice." Alexander shot Lena a look over his shoulder. She had the grace to look embarrassed. "I may have editorialized a bit when telling him about you," she admitted. "I see," Alexander replied dryly. To Elliot, he said, "And what do you think? Am I not very nice?" Elliot considered this seriously, his small brow furrowed in thought. "I don't know yet," he said finally. "Mom says you never wanted me. Were she and I right? The question hit Alexander like a physical blow. The directness, the vulnerability behind it, he wasn't prepared for either. In business, he prided himself on always having the right answer, on never being caught off guard. But this small boy had managed to do what board members and business rivals had failed to do for years. He'd left Alexander Knight speechless. In the silence that stretched between them, Alexander's mind raced back 9 years. To the day Lena had walked out of his life. He'd let her go without a fight, convinced it was the right decision for his career, his future. He'd never once considered that she might have been carrying his child. Would it have made a difference if he'd known? He'd like to think not. He'd been focused, ambitious, determined to make Knight Enterprises a global powerhouse. A child would have been a distraction at best, a liability at worst. At least, that's what he would have thought then. But now, looking at this small person with his eyes and his jawline, Alexander felt something shifting inside him, a crack in the armor he'd spent decades building. "I didn't know about you," he said finally, his voice unusually gentle. "I can't say what I would have wanted then, but you're here now." It wasn't an answer, not really, but it seemed to satisfy Elliot, who nodded solemnly. "Can I stay?" he asked. "Just for a little while? I promise I won't touch anything expensive." Alexander looked to Lena, who had watched the entire exchange with a strange mix of hope and resignation on her face. "You want to stay here? In my penthouse?" "Just for a few days," Lena said quickly. "I have some medical things to take care of. It would help if Elliot could stay somewhere, with someone, stable." Alexander wanted to refuse. His life was carefully ordered, perfectly controlled. A child, his child, would introduce chaos, emotion, attachment, all the things he'd spent years avoiding. But then Elliot said quietly, almost to himself, "I don't want to be alone." And something inside Alexander shifted again. A memory surfaced, himself at 8 years old, sitting in a too-big chair in his father's study, hearing the words that would shape his life. "Night men don't need anyone, son. Remember that. Need makes you weak." Alexander had taken those words to heart, built his life around them. Looking at Elliot now, he wondered for the first time if his father had been wrong. "You can stay," he heard himself say, "but just for a few days." The smile that broke across Elliot's face was like the sun emerging from behind clouds, bright, warm, transformative. It changed his whole face, and Alexander found himself smiling back reflexively. Lena's eyes widened in surprise, then softened with something that looked dangerously like hope. "Thank you," she said simply. Alexander nodded, already wondering if he'd lost his mind. "The guest rooms are down that hall," he said, pointing. "Make yourselves comfortable. We'll figure the rest out tomorrow." As Lena guided Elliot toward the hallway, the boy paused and looked back at Alexander. "Happy birthday," he said with a small smile. "I didn't bring a present." Alexander looked at the boy, his son, and felt a strange tightness in his chest. "That's okay," he said quietly. "You brought enough." The next morning, Alexander woke to the unfamiliar sound of voices in his kitchen. For a moment, he lay still, disoriented. His penthouse was never noisy. That was one of the things he valued most about it. The perfect controlled silence that allowed him to think, to plan, to maintain his grip on his carefully ordered world. Then the events of the previous night came rushing back. Lena, the boy, his son, Elliot. Alexander sat up, running a hand through his disheveled hair. He had barely slept, his mind racing with implications, possibilities, and an unfamiliar emotion that might have been panic, or perhaps something else entirely. He dressed methodically, drawing comfort from the familiar routine: charcoal gray suit, crisp white shirt, blue tie, armor against a world that had suddenly become unpredictable. When he emerged from his bedroom, the scene in his kitchen momentarily stopped him in his tracks. Lena stood at the stove, spatula in hand, making what smelled like pancakes. Elliot sat at the counter, swinging his legs and chattering animatedly. They looked comfortable, at home, as if they belonged there. The thought sent a jolt of something like alarm through Alexander. "Good morning," Lena said, spotting him first. Her smile was cautious, a peace offering. "I hope you don't mind. Elliot was hungry, and your kitchen is impressively stocked for someone who probably never cooks." "My housekeeper ensures I have everything I might need," Alexander replied stiffly. though pancakes aren't typically on my breakfast menu. What do you usually eat? Elliot asked, turning on his stool to face Alexander. The boy was already dressed in jeans and a blue t-shirt that brought out the green of his eyes, Alexander's eyes. Protein shake, Alexander said, moving to the coffee machine. Sometimes eggs. Elliot's nose wrinkled. That's boring. Elliot, Lena admonished gently. Not everyone likes sugary breakfasts. Pancakes aren't just sugar, Elliot argued. They have flour and eggs and milk too. That's like 3 food groups. Despite himself, Alexander felt his lips twitch. The boy had a quick mind, at least. Your nutritional analysis needs work, he said dryly. Elliot grinned, clearly pleased to have gotten a reaction. Mom says I'm good at math. Are you good at math too? Alexander glanced at Lena, who was flipping a pancake with focused attention, though he suspected she was listening intently. Yes, he said simply. Math is essential in business. Mom teaches math, Elliot said proudly. She's the best teacher in her school. Alexander raised an eyebrow at Lena. You teach? She nodded, sliding a pancake onto a plate. 8th grade math at Westridge Middle School. Going on 9 years now. 9 years. Right after they had parted ways. After he had made it clear that her place in his life was temporary, that his career came first. She had built a life without him, raised his son without him, never once reaching out for help or acknowledgement. Until now. Do you have to work today? Elliot asked, interrupting Alexander's thoughts. I always work, Alexander replied automatically. Even on Saturdays? Especially on Saturdays. Fewer distractions. Elliot considered this. That sounds lonely. The simple observation, delivered without judgment, hit Alexander harder than he expected. Before he could respond, his phone rang. Jessica, probably wondering why he wasn't at the office yet. Night, he answered crisply. Sir, the Tokyo investors are on the line. They're concerned about the market fluctuations and want to speak with you directly. Alexander checked his watch. He was already an hour behind schedule. Tell them I'll call back in 10 minutes, he said, then ended the call before Jessica could respond. You need to go, Lena said. It wasn't a question. Alexander nodded, already mentally shifting into work mode, grateful for the familiar territory. I have meetings all day. I'll be back tonight. We'll be fine, Lena assured him. Take your time. Alexander hesitated, feeling strangely like he was forgetting something important. His gaze fell on Elliot, who was watching him with those disconcertingly familiar green eyes. Will you come back? The boy asked quietly. The question caught Alexander off guard. Of course, he said, frowning. This is my home. Sometimes people say they'll come back, but they don't, Elliot explained with the straightforward honesty of a child. My friend Tyler's dad said that, but he went to California instead. Alexander felt a flash of irritation at this unknown man who had broken a promise to a child. I always keep my word, he said firmly. I'll be back tonight. Elliot studied him for a moment, then nodded, apparently satisfied. Okay, can I use your TV? Mom only lets me watch an hour a day, but your TV is bigger than our whole living room, and it would be a waste not to use it. Alexander glanced at Lena, who had an amused expression on her face. That's up to your mother, he said diplomatically. 1 hour, Lena confirmed, and only after you've read for an hour first. Elliot groaned dramatically, but there was no real protest in it. A practiced exchange then. A routine between mother and son that had been established long before Alexander entered the picture, or re-entered it, as the case may be. I need to go, Alexander said, uncomfortable with the domestic scene playing out in his usually sterile kitchen. Help yourselves to whatever you need. Jessica programmed the security system to recognize you both. With that, he grabbed his briefcase and strode to the elevator, relief washing over him as the doors closed. In the confines of the descending elevator, he could almost pretend that nothing had changed, that his life was still perfectly ordered, controlled, predictable. But as the elevator reached the lobby and the doors opened, his phone pinged with a text from a number he didn't recognize. Thank you for letting us stay. It means more than you know. L. Alexander stared at the message, an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. With a decisive swipe, he tucked the phone back into his pocket and stepped out into the crisp morning air, where his driver waited with the car door open. Business, focus, control. That's what he needed now. But throughout his meetings, conference calls, and strategy sessions, his mind kept drifting back to a pair of green eyes and a surprisingly direct question: will you come back? By the time Alexander returned to his penthouse that evening, the sun had long since set. He had stretched his workday as long as possible, taking calls he would normally have delegated, reviewing reports that could have waited until Monday. Anything to avoid returning to the uncertainty that waited at home. Home. The word felt strange now. His penthouse had always been a space, a possession, an investment, not a home. The elevator doors opened silently. Alexander stepped out, half expecting to find his living space return to its usual pristine state, empty and quiet. Instead, he found Elliot sprawled on the floor in front of the massive television, surrounded by sheets of paper covered in colorful drawings. At the sound of the elevator, the boy looked up, his face breaking into a smile that was both cautious and hopeful. "You came back," he said, and there was no hiding the relief in his voice. "I said I would," Alexander replied, setting down his briefcase. Alexander took the papers, oddly touched by the childish scrawls. No one had given him artwork since, well, ever, as far as he could remember. "These are creative," he said carefully. "I know they're not very good," Elliot said with a shrug, "but Mom says it's important to try things even if you're not good at them yet. That's how you get better." The simple wisdom caught Alexander by surprise. In his world, failure was not an option. You succeeded or you were replaced. The idea of trying something without guaranteed success was foreign to him. "Where is your mother?" he asked, looking around the open-plan living area. Elliot's expression clouded. "In the guest room, she felt sick again." His voice dropped to a whisper. "She thinks I don't know how bad it is, but I do. I'm not a baby." The raw pain in the boy's voice struck Alexander like a physical blow. Without thinking, he knelt down to Elliot's level, the way he'd seen parents do in movies. "No," he said softly. "You're not a baby. You're very brave." Elliot blinked rapidly, clearly fighting tears. "She's going to die, isn't she?" Alexander had built his fortune on hard truths, on seeing reality clearly and making decisions based on facts, not emotions. But in this moment, faced with his son's pain, he found himself wishing for a comforting lie. But Elliot deserved better than that. "Yes," he said gently. "I believe she is." Elliot nodded, his small chin quivering with the effort to maintain control. Alexander recognized the expression all too well. It was the same one he wore in difficult board meetings or challenging negotiations. "What will happen to me?" Elliot asked, the question barely audible. Before Alexander could answer, a soft voice came from the hallway. "That's what we need to talk about." Lena stood in the doorway, pale but composed. She looked at Alexander with a mixture of hope and resignation. "All three of us." The days turned into a week, and then two. Alexander found himself caught in a strange new routine. He still went to work every day, still ran his empire with precision and control. But his evenings, once filled with solitary meals and late-night work sessions, now revolved around a small boy with his eyes and an endless stream of questions. "Why don't you have any pictures in your house?" Elliot asked one evening as they ate dinner together. Lena was resting, her strength increasingly limited as the disease progressed. Alexander paused, fork halfway to his mouth. "Pictures? You know, like photos of people or places you like." Elliot gestured around the minimalist space. "Our apartment is full of pictures. Mom says they help keep memories safe." Alexander had never considered his lack of personal mementos. His penthouse was designed to be functional, impressive, a statement of wealth and taste rather than a collection of memories. "I suppose I never saw the need," he said finally. Elliot considered this, head tilted in a way that reminded Alexander startlingly of himself. "Do you ever smile? In pictures, I mean. Mom has that one picture of you smiling, but you look different now." Another question that caught Alexander off guard. Did he smile? In business, a measured smile was a tool, deployed strategically to put others at ease or signal approval. But a genuine smile. When was the last time he had experienced one of those? Before he could formulate an answer, Elliot continued, his voice thoughtful. "Is money more important than family?" The directness of the question hit Alexander like a physical blow. In his world, such questions were draped in layers of polite corporate speak, hidden behind euphemisms and implications. No one had asked him something so bluntly in years, perhaps ever. "That's a complicated question," he hedged. "It's really not," Elliot replied with the simple clarity of childhood. "Mom says most things adults think are complicated are actually pretty simple. They just don't like the answers." Alexander stared at his son, momentarily speechless. Out of the mouth of babes, indeed. Was the boy right? Had he spent years complicating a simple question to avoid facing the answer? "Your mother is a wise woman," he said finally. Elliot nodded solemnly. "That's why she's a teacher. She knows stuff." Alexander found himself smiling, a real smile, unexpected and genuine. "Yes, she certainly does." That night, after Elliot had gone to bed, Alexander found himself standing in the doorway of the guest room where Lena was resting. She looked up from her book, eyebrows raised in question. "He's asleep," Alexander said softly. Lena nodded. "He wears himself out with all those questions. Always has, since he could first talk." "He's perceptive," Alexander said, struggling to find the right word. "He sees through people," Lena agreed. "Gets that from you, I think, though he uses it with more kindness than you ever did." The observation stung, but Alexander couldn't deny its accuracy. "How are you feeling?" he asked, changing the subject. Lena's smile was tired but genuine. "About as well as can be expected. The new medication helps with the pain at least." Alexander hesitated, then entered the room fully, taking a seat in the chair beside her bed. "Lena, we need to discuss what happens next. The doctor said—" "I know what the doctor said," Lena interrupted gently. "Better than you do, in fact. I've had more time to get used to the idea." Her calm acceptance of her fate unsettled Alexander more than tears or anger would have. In business, he respected pragmatism, valued clear-eyed assessments of reality. But facing death with such grace, that was a kind of strength he wasn't sure he possessed. "What do you want for him?" Alexander asked, the question feeling inadequate, even as he voiced it. Lena's eyes, though tired, were sharp with intelligence and love. "I want him to be safe, to be loved, to never doubt his worth or feel like he's a burden." "And you think I can give him that?" The skepticism in Alexander's voice was clear. "I think you can try," Lena replied simply. "That's all any parent can do, in the end. Try their best." Alexander ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of frustration. "I don't know how to be a father, Lena. My own father was not someone to emulate." "I know," Lena said softly. "You told me once. One of the few times you ever spoke about your past." Had he? Alexander could barely remember. Those 3 months with Lena had been a blur of unexpected emotion, a departure from his carefully controlled existence that had both thrilled and terrified him. Perhaps that's why he had ended it so abruptly, so coldly, fear dressed up as practicality. "Elliot deserves better than what I can offer," he said finally. "Maybe," Lena agreed, surprising him. "But what he needs is you, his father. Not a perfect parent, those don't exist, but someone who will put him first. Can you do that, Alexander? Can you put someone else's needs above your own?" The question hung in the air between them, challenging and honest. Before Alexander could answer, a small sound from the doorway drew their attention. Elliot stood there in his pajamas, a stuffed dinosaur clutched in one hand. "I had a bad dream," he said, his voice small. Lena held out her arms, and Elliot ran to her, burying his face against her shoulder. Alexander watched as she stroked the boy's hair, murmuring soft reassurances. The scene was so intimate, so full of easy love, that Alexander felt like an intruder. He rose to leave, but Elliot's voice stopped him. "Can you stay too?" the boy asked, peering over Lena's shoulder. "Just until I fall asleep again?" Alexander hesitated, caught between the unfamiliar pull of this request and his instinct to retreat to safer, more controlled territory. "I have work to do," he said automatically. Elliot's face fell slightly, but he nodded with a resignation that seemed too mature for his years. "That's okay. I understand." It was the acceptance in the boy's voice that undid Alexander, as if Elliot had already learned not to expect much from him. as if, in the span of mere weeks, his son had already categorized him as someone who would choose work over family every time, just like his own father had. "The work can wait," Alexander heard himself say. "I'll stay." The smile that broke across Elliot's face was like the sun emerging from behind clouds, pure, bright, transformative. "Really? Really?" Alexander confirmed, settling back into the chair. Lena's eyes met his over Elliot's head, filled with a complex mixture of surprise, gratitude, and something else he couldn't quite name. Pride, perhaps? Not in him, but in their son, who had somehow managed to do what no business rival or board member had ever accomplished: make Alexander Knight set aside his work for something more important. As Elliot drifted back to sleep, safe between them, Alexander found himself studying the boy's face. The shape of his eyes, the curve of his cheek, the stubborn set of his jaw even in sleep, all so familiar, yet combined in a way that was uniquely Elliot, his son. The thought no longer felt foreign or terrifying, just true. The days that followed fell into a pattern. Alexander would work during the day, but he began coming home earlier, his evening meetings rescheduled or delegated. Jessica, his assistant, had given him a strange look the first time he'd told her to clear his evening schedule, but she'd adapted quickly. If she had questions about the sudden appearance of a woman and child in her boss's life, she kept them to herself. One evening, Alexander returned to find the penthouse unusually quiet. No television sounds, no Elliot chattering, no signs of the life that had begun to fill the once sterile space. A momentary panic gripped him. Had they left? Had Lena taken Elliot away, deciding Alexander was a lost cause after all? The relief he felt upon finding them in his home office was both intense and unsettling. Elliot sat in Alexander's chair, staring at an old photograph that Alexander kept locked in his desk drawer, one of the few personal items he owned. The boy looked up as Alexander entered, his expression solemn. "I found this," he said, holding up the photograph, "when I was looking for paper to draw on." Alexander approached slowly. The photograph showed a much younger version of himself with Lena, their faces close together, both laughing at something now forgotten. It had been taken during those 3 brief months they'd spent together, at a rare moment when Alexander had let his guard down. "You shouldn't go through other people's things without permission," Alexander said, but there was no anger in his voice. "I know," Elliot admitted. "I'm sorry, but—" He looked down at the photo again. "I don't understand. If you didn't want me, why did you love Mom?" The question hung in the air between them, simple yet devastating in its directness. Alexander had no ready answer, no corporate speak to hide behind, no way to deflect or redirect. "I don't know," he said finally, honestly. "I wasn't good at loving people back then. Maybe I'm still not. But your mother—" He paused, searching for words that felt entirely inadequate. "Your mother made me feel like I could be more than just Knight Enterprises, for a little while at least." "And then you got scared?" Elliot asked, his perception once again cutting straight to the heart of things. Alexander stared at his son, momentarily speechless. Was that what had happened? Had he, the fearless entrepreneur, the ruthless businessman, simply been afraid? "I think maybe I was," he admitted quietly. Elliot nodded, as if this confirmed a theory he'd been developing. "Mom says everyone gets scared sometimes, even grown-ups, especially about important things." "Your mother is right," Alexander said. Again, Elliot carefully placed the photograph on the desk. "She's getting worse," he said, his voice small but steady. "I can tell. She thinks I don't notice when she's in pain, but I do." Alexander felt a tightness in his chest that had become familiar these past weeks, a physical manifestation of emotions he'd spent decades ignoring. "I know," he said simply. "What's going to happen to me?" Elliot asked, the question barely above a whisper. "When she's gone?" Alexander knelt in front of the chair, bringing himself eye level with his son. His knees protested. He wasn't used to kneeling for anyone, but in this moment, nothing mattered except making sure Elliot understood what he was about to say. "You'll stay with me," he said, his voice firm and clear. "This will be your home. I will be here for you. Always." Elliot's eyes, his eyes, searched his face, looking for any sign of hesitation or deceit. "Promise?" "I promise," Alexander said, and was surprised by how easy the words came, how right they felt. Elliot nodded, accepting the vow with the solemnity it deserved. Then, in a movement so quick Alexander had no time to prepare, the boy launched himself forward, small arms wrapping around Alexander's neck in a fierce hug. Alexander froze. The sensation of being hugged so foreign, it took his brain several seconds to process. Then, slowly, he brought his arms up and around the small body, returning the embrace with a tenderness he hadn't known he possessed. "I was worried you'd send me away," Elliot mumbled against his shoulder. "To a school or something, like in the books." "Never," Alexander said, surprised by the fierceness in his own voice. "You belong here, with me." And as he held his son, Alexander realized with a clarity that had eluded him for 38 years that he meant every word. His life, once measured in deals closed and profits made, had shifted on its axis. The center of his world was no longer Knight Enterprises, but this small boy with his questions and his dinosaur pajamas and his unflinching honesty. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like coming home. The next morning, Lena collapsed while making breakfast. Alexander called an ambulance, his voice steady even as his hands shook. Elliot stood frozen in the doorway, watching as paramedics loaded his mother onto a stretcher, her face pale and still against the white sheets. In the hospital waiting room, Elliot sat beside Alexander, small hand gripping his larger one with surprising strength. When the doctor finally approached, his expression grave, Alexander knew before a word was spoken. "I'm sorry," the doctor said quietly. "The cancer has spread more aggressively than we anticipated. We've made her comfortable, but—" "How long?" Alexander asked, his businessman's mind immediately calculating, preparing, planning. The doctor's eyes flicked briefly to Elliot, then back to Alexander. "Hours, maybe. Not days." Alexander nodded, absorbing the information with outward calm, while his mind raced. How did one prepare a child for this? What words could possibly soften such a blow? Before he could formulate a plan, Elliot spoke, his voice small but steady. "Can I see her?" The doctor nodded. "Of course. She's asking for both of you." Lena lay in the hospital bed, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the sterile white room and the inexorable approach of death. But her eyes, when they found Elliot, were still bright with love. "Hey, kiddo," she said softly, holding out a hand. Elliot approached the bed, his steps hesitant but determined. "Hey, Mom." Alexander hung back, uncertain of his place in this most intimate of moments. But Lena's gaze found him, and with her free hand, she beckoned him closer. "Alexander," she whispered, her voice weak but urgent. "Promise me, he won't be alone." The words echoed in Alexander's mind, carrying the weight of all that had changed, all that still needed to change. He moved to the bedside, standing opposite Elliot, the three of them forming a tableau he never could have imagined just weeks ago. "I promise," he said, his voice steady despite the unfamiliar ache in his throat. "He'll never be alone, Lena. I swear it." She studied his face, looking for any hint of hesitation or deceit. Finding none, she nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "I believe you," she said simply. Elliot was trying so hard to be brave, his small body rigid with the effort of holding back tears. Alexander recognized the stance, the determined set of the jaw, a mirror of his own response to emotional pain. But in his son, it broke his heart to see it. Without thinking, Alexander knelt beside the bed, bringing himself to Elliot's eye level. "It's okay to cry," he said softly. "Being brave doesn't mean you can't feel sad." Something in Elliot's expression crumpled at the permission, and he collapsed against his mother's side, tears finally flowing freely. Lena stroked his hair with a trembling hand, murmuring words of comfort that Alexander couldn't quite hear. In that moment, watching his son grieve for a mother who was slipping away, Alexander made a decision that would have seemed inconceivable just weeks ago. He knelt beside Elliot and made the choice he never thought he would. "You're coming home with me," he said, his voice low but firm. "Forever." Elliot looked up, his face wet with tears, hope battling with grief in his expression. "Really? Really," Alexander confirmed. "No matter what happens, you will always have a home with me. I promise." Lena's eyes met Alexander's over their son's head, filled with a gratitude so profound it was almost painful to witness. "Thank you," she whispered. Alexander nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't thinking about Knight Enterprises, about profits and losses, about maintaining control. All that mattered was the small boy beside him and the promise he had just made. Lena died peacefully 3 days later, with Elliot asleep in a chair beside her bed and Alexander standing watch. Her passing was quiet, a gentle exhalation followed by silence. Alexander was the only one to witness it, and as he looked at her still face, beautiful even in death, he felt an unexpected surge of gratitude. She had given him a gift beyond measure, a son, a chance to be more than just a successful businessman, an opportunity to love unconditionally, to put someone else first, to become the man she had perhaps always believed he could be. "Thank you," he whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "I'll take care of him, I swear it." The weeks that followed were a blur of legal paperwork, funeral arrangements, and adjustment. Alexander officially became Elliot's legal guardian, a process expedited by his team of lawyers and his considerable influence. Knight Enterprises continued to function under the guidance of his executives, who had been stunned by Alexander's announcement that he would be taking a leave of absence for personal reasons. "Personal reasons?" Jessica had repeated, clearly shocked. In 10 years of working for Alexander Knight, she had never known him to take so much as a sick day, let alone an extended leave. "Family matters," Alexander had explained simply, offering no further details. The staff at his penthouse, used to catering to a solitary, exacting bachelor, were equally surprised by the changes their employer implemented. The spare bedroom was transformed into a proper room for Elliot, complete with a desk for homework, bookshelves filled with age-appropriate reads, and, at Elliot's insistence, glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. "Mom and I had those in our apartment," Elliot had explained. "She said they would help me remember that, even in the dark, there's always light." Alexander had nodded, throat tight, and immediately ordered the best ones available. Establishing a routine was challenging. Alexander, used to working 16-hour days and making decisions that affected thousands of employees, now found himself navigating school drop-offs, soccer practices, and the surprisingly complex world of 8-year-old social dynamics. "Dad," Elliot called one afternoon as Alexander picked him up from school. The word still sent a jolt through Alexander every time he heard it. Dad. A simple syllable that carried the weight of responsibility, love, and a future he was still learning to envision. "Yes?" Alexander replied, helping Elliot into the back seat of the car. "Can Jason come over tomorrow? We have to work on our science project together." Alexander hesitated. He had planned to take Elliot to the office tomorrow to show him around Knight Enterprises. It was Saturday, and he had thought, but no. This was part of being a parent, wasn't it? Adjusting plans, prioritizing his son's needs. "Of course," he said. "I'll have Mrs. Henderson prepare snacks." Elliot's face lit up. "Awesome! Jason's gonna flip when he sees our place." Our place. The casual possessive warmed something in Alexander's chest. The penthouse, once just a symbol of his success, had become a home, their home. The transition wasn't without challenges. Alexander, used to making unilateral decisions, had to learn the art of compromise. Elliot, grieving his mother while adjusting to a new home and a father he was just getting to know, had his moments of anger and rebellion. "You're not my mom!" he had shouted one night when Alexander insisted on a reasonable bedtime. "You can't tell me what to do." The words had stung, but Alexander had taken a deep breath, remembering Lena's patience. "No, I'm not your mom," he had agreed quietly. "I could never replace her, but I am your father, and I love you. Part of loving you is making sure you get enough sleep." Elliot had stared at him, green eyes wide with surprise at the word love, before stomping off to his room. But he had gone to bed as asked, and the next morning he had slipped his hand into Alexander's as they walked to the car, a silent apology that Alexander treasured more than any business deal he had ever closed. The staff at Knight Enterprises were stunned by the changes in their CEO. The man who had once ruled his company with an iron grip, who had been known for his cold logic and relentless drive, now canceled meetings to attend school functions. He left the office at reasonable hours. He smiled, actually smiled, when showing off pictures of a dark-haired boy with his eyes. "He's different," Jessica remarked to the CFO one day. almost human. The CFO, who had worked with Alexander for over a decade, could only nod in amazement. Whoever would have thought? Alexander Knight, family man. 3 months after Lena's death, Alexander was in his home office reviewing quarterly reports when Elliot knocked on the door, a hesitant expression on his face. "Dad, can I come in?" Alexander immediately set the reports aside. "Of course." Elliot entered, clutching a piece of paper to his chest. "I made something for you." "Oh?" Alexander raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Elliot's artistic endeavors usually involved elaborate dinosaur battles or futuristic cities. This seemed different. Elliot approached the desk, suddenly shy. "You don't have to like it. It's not very good." "I'm sure it's excellent," Alexander assured him, reaching out a hand. Slowly, reluctantly, Elliot handed over the paper. It was a drawing, carefully executed with colored pencils. It showed 3 figures standing together, a tall man in a suit, a small boy, and between them, a woman with a warm smile. At the bottom, in Elliot's careful handwriting, were the words, "My family." Alexander stared at the drawing, a sudden lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. The simplicity of it, the love evident in every careful stroke, hit him with unexpected force. "Do you like it?" Elliot asked anxiously, mistaking his silence for disappointment. "I love it," Alexander managed, his voice rough with emotion. "It's perfect." Elliot's face lit up. "Really? Mom always said I was a terrible artist." "She was wrong," Alexander said firmly. "This is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me." Elliot beamed, pleased beyond measure by the praise. "You can keep it if you want." "Keep it?" Alexander stood, drawing still in hand. "Elliot, this deserves to be framed. Come on." He led a surprised Elliot to the living room, where an array of expensive art pieces hung on the walls, carefully selected by an interior designer for their investment value rather than any personal meaning. Without hesitation, Alexander took down a minimalist painting that had cost more than most people's cars. "This spot is perfect," he declared, propping the drawing against the wall to see how it looked. Elliot's eyes widened. "But that's where your fancy art goes?" "This is fancy art," Alexander corrected him. "More importantly, it's our family. It belongs here." He turned to Elliot, suddenly serious. "Is that okay with you, including your mom in our family pictures?" Elliot nodded, relief evident in his expression. "She's still my mom, even though she's gone." "Yes, she is," Alexander agreed softly. "And she always will be." The next day, Alexander had the drawing professionally framed, the first personal item to grace the walls of his once sterile penthouse. He hung it himself, making sure it was perfectly level, while Elliot watched with pride. "Now, people will know we're a family when they come over," the boy said with satisfaction. Family. The word still amazed Alexander. For so long, his identity had been wrapped up in being the CEO of Knight Enterprises, the billionaire bachelor, the ruthless businessman. Now, the role he valued most was simply dad. That night, after tucking Elliot into bed, another ritual that had once seemed foreign but now felt as natural as breathing, Alexander stood in the doorway, watching his son's chest rise and fall in sleep. The glow-in-the-dark stars cast a gentle light over the room, turning the ordinary bedroom into something magical. "Night, Dad," Elliot murmured sleepily, eyes already closed. "Love you." "I love you too," Alexander replied, the words coming easily now, no longer foreign or frightening. As he quietly closed the door, Alexander realized that this moment, this feeling, this love, was what had been missing from his life. Not more money, not more success, not more power. Just this. A small boy who called him Dad. A home filled with laughter and questions and the occasional argument. A life with meaning beyond the bottom line. He walked to the living room and stopped in front of the framed drawing. The 3 figures, himself, Elliot, and Lena, smiled back at him. "My family," the childish writing proclaimed, and Alexander found himself nodding in agreement. Yes, this was his family. Incomplete, perhaps, with Lena gone too soon. Imperfect, certainly, as he stumbled through the unfamiliar territory of fatherhood, but real, and his. Alexander Knight, the billionaire CEO who had once valued control above all else, now found himself grateful for the chaos, the uncertainty, the messy emotions that came with loving someone more than himself. His carefully structured world had indeed unraveled, and in its place, something far more precious had emerged. As he gazed at the drawing, Alexander made a silent promise to Lena, wherever she might be. He would love their son fiercely and completely. He would make sure Elliot never doubted his worth or felt alone. He would be the father that Elliot deserved, not perfect, but present. Always present, and perhaps, in doing so, he might become the man that Lena had always believed he could be. Alexander touched the frame gently, a smile, a real smile, warm and genuine, lifting the corners of his mouth. His life, once measured in deals closed and profits made, had found a new metric of success, the happiness of the small boy sleeping down the hall. It was, he reflected as he turned off the lights and headed to his own room, the most valuable asset he had ever acquired. And unlike every other investment he had ever made, this one had changed not just his portfolio, but his heart. If you enjoyed this heartwarming story of transformation and unexpected love, please like, share, and subscribe. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from.